Many questions on my conversation with Jordan Peterson. Jordan is the clinical psychologist I had on 2 podcasts back, and we got bogged down in a conversation about scientific epistemology on the question of truth. Many listeners seem confused about my reasons for not accepting Peterson's version of truth, which amounted to some odd form of pragmatism pegged to our ultimate survival as a species. If you recall, according to Peterson, a claim is true if it helps us survive, and false or not true enough if it doesn't. I see so much wrong with this claim that it was really hard to know where to begin. And while I don't think I said this in the podcast, one wonders whether this claim applies to itself. Is this claim about truth only true if it helps us survive? And what if it doesn't? Does it then bite its own tail and just disappear? Do you see the problem there? But I went round and round with Peterson for 2 hours on this, and this prevented us from getting into topics that listeners really wanted us to explore. Again, he was my most requested podcast guest ever. Now, some of Peterson's fans blamed me for this entirely, and they were alleging mostly that I'm a materialist and that I'm somehow dogmatically opposed to the idea that mind might play some role in defining reality or parts of it. But that's just not true. And it's not even relevant as far as I can see. I mean, even if it were true. I mean, if mind helps create reality, I would just claim that we can stand outside those facts as well and say they are true whether or not anyone knows them, right? So for instance, if it's true to say that the moon really isn't there unless someone is looking at it, which is to say consciousness is somehow constitutive of its being in reality, well, that fact about the mind's power would be true whether or not any of us know about it or understand it, right? So you can still get a realistic picture of truth being as spooky as you want about the mind. All I was arguing for was that there are facts of the matter whether or not anyone understands them, and some of these facts have nothing to do with the survival of the species. Now, some other defenders of Peterson have argued that I just don't understand pragmatism. Okay, but that's not true either, as far as I can tell. Pragmatism in its usual form has to make sense of the kinds of challenges I was posing to Peterson. Okay, but Peterson's version wasn't doing that. Pragmatism isn't just predicated on survival. It's predicated on what works in conversation, what actually conserves the data, what makes our statements about the world seem to cohere, and the kinds of statements that square with our experience, the kinds that become predictive of future experience scientifically. All of that is what it means to be pragmatic in the usual sense. Most of that has nothing to do with the survival of the species. So again, statements about prime numbers can be understood pragmatically. When I make a claim that there is a prime number higher than any we have represented, unfortunately, that's actually a paradox. To say that there's a prime number larger than any we have represented is, in fact, to represent it. But leaving that aside, right, let's talk about explicitly representing it, which is to say it hasn't been discovered yet. There are different ways to think about that being true, but a pragmatic way is just to say, well, it certainly seems true. Those kinds of statements function and conserve the experience of what it's like to be us continually discovering new prime numbers or seeming to discover them. It doesn't mean that there is a reality outside of our conversation where prime numbers really exist. That's what the pragmatist wants to say. Now, of course, the mathematical idealist wants to say that there is some realm of number on some level to be discovered by sentient beings like ourselves. And it exists in some sense whether or not we discover it. This is the kind of thing I got into with Max Tegmark, who seems to be fairly idealistic on this topic. In any case, normal pragmatism can skate across that thin ice fairly elegantly, if not persuasively. But a pragmatism that suggests that every statement about prime numbers must be resolved in terms of the survival of apes like ourselves, that doesn't make any sense. But I couldn't seem to get Peterson to acknowledge that. And most of you, the vast majority of you, it seems to me, thought I made that case fairly well, and therefore you agreed with me that Peterson's concept of truth was pretty wacky, or at least that he wasn't communicating it well. But many of you still faulted me as a podcast host for not being gracious enough to just move on to other topics once we reached that impasse. Now, I totally understand that criticism, and I even, I think, anticipated it at some point in the podcast, and I might have even learned something from it. We'll see what I'm like next time I get bogged down like that with a guest. But the truth is, I'm not a normal podcast host. I view these exchanges as conversations, not really as interviews, though occasionally it does play out a little bit like an interview. But I'm usually trying to have a conversation, and I'm trying to pressure test my own views and refine my own understanding of the world. So if the person I'm talking to isn't making any sense, at least to me, I really want to get to the bottom of what the problem is. And now this is necessarily intrusive, because on many of these points, really one of us has to be wrong, or at least confused. And in this case, the disagreement was so fundamental, and I knew Jordan wanted to move on to topics like the existence of Jungian archetypes, for instance. And I just couldn't see how we were going to make sense on that topic if we couldn't agree about what it means to say that something is true, right? I mean, how do you distinguish fact from fantasy? We couldn't converge there really at all. And the next topics on the menu were things like archetypes and mythology and the reality of Christian doctrine. And I wanted to get on to those topics because I knew how much our listeners wanted us to get there. I was making increasingly desperate attempts to try to get to some consensus so that we could move on. And this had somewhat the character of my attempting to perform an exorcism, which didn't work. It was like that scene in The Exorcist when Max von Sydow does his whole spiel in Latin and still winds up with a face full of green vomit. Anyway, at the end of that podcast, those of you who heard it know, if you got to the end, I put it out to all of you to crowdsource the postmortem on it, to tell us what happened, and to decide whether we should go forward and have a second conversation on other topics. And I put out a poll on Twitter, which about 30,000 of you responded to, and 81% of you said yes, we should have another conversation. Now, I got to think that poll went fairly viral among Jordan's crowd, because on my own social media channels, I got a lot of complaints about the conversation, and I'd be very surprised if 81% of my listeners want to hear Jordan and I go round and round again. But I will take this recommendation seriously. I don't yet know what I'm going to do. It's somewhat amusing and somewhat disconcerting that a fairly frequent criticism from Jordan's crowd seems to be that I didn't let the conversation move on because I was afraid that Jordan was going to dismantle my atheism, that he was going to say something there that was so powerful or so well-reasoned that he would have revealed my doubts about God to be completely bankrupt. I got to say I'm open to that, but the fact that anyone thinks that is the reason why I didn't move on, I got to hope that those of you who are regular listeners to the podcast know me better than that. Anyway, I will let you know if Jordan's coming back on. I'm going to have a few more podcast guests in the meantime before I rethink that. I guess the implications of putting it to a vote would be that I would simply do whatever the majority of you say I should do. I'm not sure this is actually a democracy. I may be a little more autocratic than that, but I certainly hope Jordan realizes there are no hard feelings. I just, in everything he has said since the podcast, some of which I responded to on my blog, none of that has clarified his position to me. And if we do go for a second round, I think we really do have to avoid getting bogged down again the way we did. So I have to figure out some kind of guidelines so that we can actually have a conversation that is productive and not excruciating for all of you. So more on that when I figure it out.